Hi, my name is Cisco Maldonado, still. I'm currently head of marketing for the Motion Picture and Television Fund, a wonderful organization. I'll give a plug, mbtf.com. Volunteer to join me.
You can talk about what the fund does too.
Well, it is one of the oldest nonprofits in the country. Started almost 100 years ago with Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin, and we help folks in the entertainment industry whenever life takes a left turn. So if you're like a union worker and you're missing your hours, you can't get your benefits, we fix those things. We help people with their rent, we give people airline tickets to visit sick relatives. There's a lot of things that we do, and we've been around for years and years and years, and we've gotten great support from George Clooney's of the world, Hugh Jackman's, you name it. Go to the website, you'll be pleased to see a couple of great things. I also used to be the director of global brand management for DC Comics. I did it for about 6 years, and I was at Warner Brothers Proper for another 7. In relation to this particular panel, I've been working over the last year and a half with a partner to grow and develop an esports franchise like a Team Liquid or like a Team Solomon that hopefully we can go and develop, and you'll be seeing more of us in the near future.
All right. My name is Amina Keshin Kamal. I'm a recent graduate of ASU Law. I focused my studies on esports, media law, copyright law, and all the things that encompass intellectual property law. So going in, I knew that I would let go of that part of my life. I'd like to think of myself as a creative person, and law school couldn't really beat that out of me. So I'm a lawyer, gamer, artist. List goes on. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Gabe Lim. I also recently graduated from ASU Law. In terms of esports, I'm honestly not very good. I do play Overwatch sometimes, and like you, sir, I also main Diva or Lucio. Generally not because I enjoy it, but because everyone else wants to play DPS. I'm usually pretty easy to find because I'm normally the only one pushing the payload.
My name is Alex Becker, also recent grad of ASU Law. I studied mostly tax. In terms of games, I play Hearthstone, if anyone's out there. It's a fun one. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
And my name is Andrew Theory. I am also a recent graduate of ASU. This is my cosplay as a real lawyer who's already passed the bar. And I've been interested primarily in IP, patent, trademarks, copyright, and cursorily interested in games and esports probably more than I should have during school, but recently have decided to focus on that as a bona fide career because it is a growing field. There's a great need not only for the legal side, but just for players, for content creators, for managers, coaches. There are a whole bunch of ways to get involved with this industry if you so desire. So if you would direct your attention to the right side of your right, my left, of the hall, we've got a presentation for you guys. We're going to go through a little bit about what esports is, what the industry of esports looks like, legal things that we feel that you should know as people who are interested in getting involved with esports as an industry, and some forward-looking thoughts at the end about what the future of this industry may entail. So I'm going to write you across here. We're going to start out with, hopefully this works, a little video. This is a couple minutes long. This is produced by Riot, and will give you hopefully a little bit of an idea, if you're not familiar already, with what esports is generally.
Have you guys seen esports and the E-League? I don't know if that's sports.
You know, I didn't test out beforehand.
I can provide the voiceover.
Wow.
But I don't know if athlete is the right word that I would go for.
Sweat, I don't consider it a sport. That video basically just summarizes what we have for you here today.
I did not test our audio capabilities beforehand, so I
Watching people
apologize.
play
I don't
video
think this is
games
going to work.
isn't like watching people play football.
Pick out your favorite chair.
And if you want to help us with our production at any point, we obviously could use it.
Right. Why don't we move forward to the next slide?
Yeah, I think we should.
Sure.
No chair, no esports. That's all.
Right.
All right. So in lieu of a very high-value production by a professional esports corporation, we're going to give you the lowdown on what esports looks like. So a short definition is that an esport is a multiplayer video game played competitively by professionals for spectators. And each of those terms is debatable. It's still very open-ended. You could, argue at length about what an esport actually is and whether or not it is a sport. We'll touch on a little bit of that during the course of this panel, but that's still a very open-ended question.
Right. There are still even questions on whether speedrunning might constitute an esport.
Right. That's an example of, maybe an outlier that has some
multiplayer.
similarities, could fall into the esports fold, but has enough that makes it a distinct entity. If you're not familiar with the sort of properties that are involved, I've made a little table here. Depending on your preference, you could be drawn to the first-person shooter genre, the sports game genre, the MOBA genre. These are all buzzwords and acronyms that I'm just throwing out, and if you don't know what they mean, they probably are meaningless to you, but basically different ways of competing in a structured environment with rules and objectives and that sort of thing. That's sort of the basis of what makes esports, in my opinion, at least in the opinions of many experts, sports, is because you have that sort of competitive structure in which players can improve, they can compete against each other, they can prove who's the best at a specific game and succeed as a result. As far as what the industry actually looks like, I put way too much time into this slide. I'm pretty proud of it, but it basically is just a structure of esports as an industry. So on the ground level, you can see you've got the players. These are the people who are actually putting in the time and the effort to create the value in this space. You've got teams just above that level. Teams are just organizations of players who've decided to band together for a common goal for whatever reason, be it a competitive purpose. Obviously, if you want to play a game like CSGO or Overwatch, you need other people on your team to compete against. They're not individual sports, but they can also provide logistical and more practical support. So, you could have sponsors in common with your team. You could have maybe shared living spaces. And most importantly, the teams are what bridge that gap between the individual players and the actual competitive space, which is the leagues. And that's the next tier up. This is where the competition actually occurs. This is where teams get together to compete against each other, and this is what is actually broadcasted. This is when, if you think of esports, like an LCS or an Overwatch league, this is, your first thought is the actual league where the teams are competing, and that's the value that's delivered to the consumers, the observers. This is where your distribution platforms like Twitch and YouTube would hook in to deliver that content to the end users and therefore create value not only for the consumers but also for sponsors, because that's where you get the eyeballs, and that's what sponsors are all about. One step above the leagues are the organizers. These are currently a mix of both official government entities and private third parties. We'll touch a little bit on this in the next slide, but the Korean Esports Association is an official government organization. Korea is ahead of us, ahead of the game, no pun intended, in a lot of these respects. And so they have an actual governmental body that oversees the leagues and provides a little bit of extra structure. But apart from that, you've got entities like ESL, MLG, DreamHack. These provide just a little bit of overlaying structure on top of the leagues. And most importantly, they are the liaison between the leagues and the developers. The developers are at the very top of the pyramid for a reason. They are the impetus behind the games as competitive platforms. They design the games, they maintain the servers on which they're played, they provide content. So they're at the top because you can imagine the IP, intellectual property, flowing downwards from them. It all originates at the developers, and then the leagues, take that IP, license it from the developers. A license is just a permission from the developer to use their IP, their game, in exchange probably for money. The developer is ultimately in charge of how the games are played, who plays them, for what purposes. You can't start a team or you can't organize a league without the permission of the developer at the end. One more thing I want to point out about this slide is that I've got these bright white lines between the tiers, but those lines are very blurry. There's a lot of vertical integration between these tiers. A lot of developers also serve as the organizers and even as the leagues. A great example is Overwatch League or the DOTA 2 International or LCS. Those are leagues that are actually organized and put on by the developers. So they have that additional interest and that additional control in the formation and operation of those leagues. All right, so that gives hopefully an idea, a structure, so that as we talk about the issues that come up, you can sort of slot those into these casts of characters that we've laid out for you. And the organizers warrant a little bit more detail because there's no current decision, there's no ruling on whether esports are sports. The best we can do is look to how they're treated from a regulatory standpoint. And so far that looks a lot like self-governance. Besides the Korean Esports Association, which I mentioned earlier, it's either the developers or independent organizations that are taking it upon themselves to govern these leagues, to enforce, certain standards in terms of contracting for the players, and that sort of thing, certain, standards of conduct for the leagues and for the teams and ultimately for the players. Question?
Yeah, sorry, I don't really have a voice, but I recently did some research on esports, and I'm wondering if maybe you're going to talk about it, but how do you feel about esports being rumored to be in the Olympics in, I think, 2024?
We actually did talk about that.
Okay.
Yes, yeah, we'll touch on that.
I argued about this point myself.
Absolutely.
That'll come at the end, I think in your section, right? You talk about the future of esports.
Yeah,
We will talk about
I can talk about that, yeah.
I'm glad you brought it up, thank you.
A little bit more about why it matters whether esports are sports. This is an issue we're probably going to mention a lot because it's a very open-ended issue, and it's really at the fundamental level of, it determines what rights and access players have, whether they're considered athletes or not. Not only for their rights as players in terms of collective bargaining or their access to legal representation, but also whether governments recognize them as athletes for the purposes of visas. There's a special visa that governments can issue for athletes that are competing in foreign countries. The US, encouragingly, has issued these sorts of visas to esports athletes in the past, and that is a small indicator, at least, that esports generally and the players specifically are being recognized more and more often as athletes competing in a bona fide sport. And also this is important for investors. It's important for the cash flow because if you want to get involved, as I'm sure Cisco will talk at length about, in esports as an investor, if you've got the money, you want an assurance on that investment to the greatest extent of law, and possibly being classified as a sport lends some stability to that.
Because if you're selling an idea to investors and they're going to give you millions of dollars to build a team, one of the questions is like, okay, do you have a team? And we're like, well, not yet. And so they ask the question, are you going to grow a team from scratch, or are you going to acquire a team that maybe is not really well known, but are good players? So here's an example. So for in league, in the Oceanic League, right, it's a smaller, right? So the Chiefs are from Australia. They're really a lot of fun to watch. They're not that good, but they do unpredictable plays, and they win just enough to piss off some of the really good teams that play ice cold, right? So I would love to say, I want to buy the Chiefs and bring them to New Jersey for whatever reason, right? That's great, but then these investors are going to have to talk with their folks and saying, like, well, can you get these guys in the States in the first place? And if things are going to get held up for months because of visas, then all of a sudden you don't have a team anymore, right? These are things you don't think about, but you start paying yourself into a corner and you have all these grand plans until you actually have to start doing things. And when you're investing and you say, okay, if you give us money here and we're going to deliver you money over here, right, the clock starts. And you usually don't factor in time for government entities to issue the paperwork for whatever reason they may or may not have.
Sure. All right. So I think I've talked enough. I'm going to pass it off to...
Well, before Gabe continues, I know we're crunched on time, but with this whole investor talk, he's the investor of our group, and we're kind of the legal...
Future ambulance chasers.
Yeah.
But
by show of hands, I just want to gauge I guess where you you fit in the esports arena. Who's, I guess, interested in the investing by a show of hands? Okay, cool.
Hey.
Way to go. You kind of,
He's
okay,
got
got
money,
it.
everyone.
Very
And how-
cool. He has a nod, okay, cool.
Anyone here just like to play?
All right.
Okay, so most reasonable
Good.
people.
Okay, okay, that sounds good. I just want to get a sense
Right.
of the room and,
Yep.
okay. Sounds good, thanks.
Right. Fantastic. So, why should we care about esports law? I think the best way to illustrate this would be with a case study. Andrew, would you move to the next slide, please?
Absolutely.
Have you ever heard the tale of Quantic Gaming, the esports team? It's not a story the LCS would tell you. Next slide, please. Let's briefly go over the fact pattern. So, Quantic Gaming was an esports team that specialized in MOBA, in particular League. They began in 2010. So, they came under new management under an individual named Simon Boudreault. He was the person responsible for owning the team. He did the investments. He got them all the way to the LCS. You know, and the idea here was that they would win. The thing is, there were several other people involved in the team in addition to the players. There were people that trained them, people who, you know, looked out for their health. They would spend hours sequestered in this gaming house. So, here's what happens. As a result, he winds up owing over $40,000 in back pay. He hasn't paid them. They get to the first round of the LCS, they're doing okay. The investors seem pretty happy because it looks like they're gonna win. Second round, Quantic gets stomped. Mr. Boudreault is in a state of disgrace. And he vanishes like a ghost, never to be seen again, not able to be found on social media, still owes $40K in back pay. Screws most of his team over. And for that reason, whether gamer or investor, or someone just casually interested in esports as a viewer, it's important to have some understanding of some of the law that may govern this new arena.
Oh, we have a hand.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Was this when the former players of Quantic got Reddit to sponsor them for a tournament or something? Was that after this? Or?
This was a little bit earlier on. Because I think this was before, but don't quote me on that.
Ready to move on?
Let's move to the next slide.
All right.
And I'm going to keep track of questions.
Right.
We have a website. I'm going to post all the lingering questions that I think that,
Right.
that I hear that you guys have, and we'll have answers to those questions. Because we like to fact check ourselves too. So we'll give you sources that we think are reliable.
Right. Now, as was previously mentioned, a lot of people who go into professional esports are required to sign contracts. And this is, of course, like just a natural part of going into athletics. They're really the thing that governs the sort of rights and protections that gamers have. Even the LCS rules, if you look at them, just by agreeing to play, it basically reads like a contract. I believe someone here wanted to speak on this?
Yeah, so I will talk about contracts as, I guess, easily understood as possible, because it is a hard thing to grasp. So I'm not going to go into the law of it, but just how it applies in real life and in a business like esports. So at any point, if you feel lost, or if I'm talking too deeply and it just doesn't make sense to you, please raise your hand and ask questions, or just say move on to something that's more sensible. So recently, according to CNN, esports will reach a global revenue of $1 billion by 2019. So that just shows where it's going. It's big, and that's why we have Cisco, someone who's really looking to invest in esports, and he has a partner, and they're really serious about
Yes,
this.
we're talking to people, like it's a matter of weeks before someone says, here you go, and then we actually have to start the clock.
Yeah. So, and this means that not only investors, but also pro players and amateur players should start thinking about prioritizing what they need to do to protect themselves, because it is a business. It's fun and games, but it's also a business. So profits all go back to the contract, the agreement. And before you sign a contract, you need to understand certain terms that can get you into trouble, and also certain terms that can protect you. And we'll talk between me and Alex Becker. We're going to talk. We kind of split contracts because it's a deep subject. But between the two of us, I hope we can get that point across to you. And again, at any time, please raise your hand and say we need more, clarification on this or that. We don't mind explaining that to you. So basically, contracts at its very core outlines the duties expected from all parties, and they give players protections. I'm going to talk about what type of protections I mean here. So according to the British Esports Association, again, this shows where esports is going. There's a British Esports Association. Even the Brits are
It's a private nonprofit at this point. It's not governmentally recognized, but they do a lot of work.
Yeah. I think it's a matter of months that it's going to become a government regulated entity. Anyway, this is my opinion. That's not a source. Anyway, what you see in a contract is working hours, salary figures, figure percentages taken from team winnings. Team winnings is huge.
Right, you have to determine who's going to get what kind of cut and what's going to be competitive when you're recruiting players.
Yeah, and who gets prize money? That money flow doesn't go to one source, it goes to different people. And some get a bigger cut of that prize money than others, and that's all going back to the contract again. Sponsorships is also huge. It's more complicated than it looks. And I have some hypos that will help with that Cisco sent me. And I think you can discuss that further too. So anyway, we also have merchandise, streaming, bonuses. This is just to describe where all the money flow is coming. It's a mixture of traditional sources and I guess non-traditional now, because streaming is new. But now a player can get a lot of money, and the team can get a lot of money, and then the developer can get a lot of money just from streaming on Twitch. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I want to make sure, yeah, perfect. So restrictions and limitations are important. These are amongst the most important terms in the contract. How long will the agreement last? We just did our episode recording with an esports lawyer. His name is Harris Peskin. He's in New York, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he's he's represented a lot of teams, right?
Yes.
In North America. And he actually said that right now, the thing to do is to have a 3-year cap on contract. 3-year cap is the to go for contracts, but the longer the contract, the better, is what he is noticing with his clients.
There's a lot of turnover amongst teams and leagues. Even the lifespan of an esport hasn't really been proven yet, but it's understandably shorter than a traditional sport would be.
Right.
So it's key to find that balancing point between value for the team and the investor and the freedom of the player to move on if they ever feel the need to.
Right.
Yeah. Also terms that show up, how long will the player be on active roster? Will the player be on active roster? Prize money, where does that go? What percentage? So for investors out there, the ones that raise their hand, these are also terms that pertain to you, because if you're creating a team, you want to know where the money's going.
And is there such thing, and I'll ask the legal experts here, something that's like a prenuptial agreement, right? So let's say that I join a team, the team's very successful, and then I start my own Twitch channel, and I start getting revenue from that, and then I leave the team. How much of that revenue am I still entitled to? Because the team owner is going to say, well, because you are on my team, you are more popular now, and because of us, you're getting this, versus no, people just like watching me because they like watching me, regardless of who I work for. I would imagine that's a kind of rider in a contract that I would need to know about.
Oh, Siri, she's chiming in.
Yeah.
Siri has something to say?
Yeah, Andrew, did you want to chime into that?
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, we're
Just making a...
It's a great hypo.
Yep.
Hypothetical.
So we're going to talk more about that too, and that all goes to the terms of the contract, and that's something that even if it's not, let's say it's not routine to write something like that in, it's up to you. You can write whatever you want in the contract. The parties either agree to it or they don't. So Cisco can bring actually you can bring a situation like that up in the contract. Say if this is to happen,
Right.
why is going to happen, or these are the different options that we have, A, B, C, and D. He can write that in. There is no rule, which is kind of nice. So as an investor, he can bring that term to the table and say, hey, this is a hypo that can turn realistic that I'm worried about. Let's take care of it in the contract.
This is a situation, of course, that can become problematic. Sorry, I had
Go
to
ahead.
chime in here.
Go ahead.
It's a situation that can become problematic because usually the people who are negotiating those contracts are themselves, and usually dealing with younger players who usually just want to play. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, well, before we go to the next slide, I will mention one more big term that's going to resonate throughout the slides. It's non-compete provisions. And this gets, everyone into trouble, especially players. It's not great for the players. And Riot Games, as I'll explain later, changed that. In 2014, they had one that was not, they had a contract that wasn't in the favor of players. In 2016, it's more player friendly, which is great. So that there's a movement there that's more in the players' favor. So just, yeah, watch out for the ability for a player to contract with a competing organization once the contract runs and terminates. Anyway, we can go to the next slide.
Right. And here is an example of a terrible contract in action. I think I had a $100 salary, 4-year contract. I believe he was, let me see, I believe he was working with CSGO. There were a lot of issues with contracts which, were just borderline unconscionable. Like, $100 salary.
Unconscionable is the term lawyers use for really, really sucks.
Yeah. I mean, thank you, Andrew. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to get out of that law school mindset. Yeah, no, this wouldn't buy you, a t-shirt in the vendor hall. Anyway.
No, but these contracts happen. As ridiculous as they are, they do. And sometimes a contract that doesn't necessarily have to be written down. It's based on, a verbal agreement.
Right.
Go ahead.
Just one quick question about maybe this particular situation or similar ones. Was it a $100 contract that was it red, or was it just that because of all the percentages this player was receiving, that's why it ended up being a $100?
No, as in usually when they negotiate the terms of the contract, it's okay, we'll give you this much for this kind of service that you'll provide. I mean, of course, in this case, I don't imagine that he, I don't imagine that he actually shared the exact terms of the contract with the rest of the public. But generally with employment contracts like that, they do specify, okay, you're getting this much, am I right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
It's likely in this example as well that there were just a lot of expenses he didn't expect and that the team wasn't covering. There were probably minimum wage laws, wherever this was, but usually it's expenses that they don't account for.
And it's also the size of the organization as well. So if you are an independent team, right, the terms of your agreement are going to be, more of an open negotiation between the owners and the actual team player. If you decide that you want to work or you want to play for Overwatch, right, and you are part of Overwatch 12, you are now an employee of Activision Blizzard, right? And they even have on their website in terms of here's what's involved, and you get benefits, you get a minimum salary, right? But then that's the end of it, in terms of contract. What happens if, Activision, they go through their system and they see your ranking, and then they draft you, right? And then you end up playing for London Spitfire, right? And everything's great, and you're making the minimum and benefits. This is awesome, right? You're getting paid to play video games. That's great. But all of a sudden, if you start going on a run and people really like watching you, and you become sort of your own brand, anything you do, depending on the contract after that, that belongs to Activision Blizzard, right? So almost like my prior comment, how much of it is because of the relationship and how much is your own innate abilities, right? And if you leave, you have to, have that non-compete clause or, making sure. There's what's fair, and then there's what the owners are willing to agree to, right? And they might not always be safe.
Go ahead.
As of right now, though, what is the standard for it? Are they just getting a base minimum salary, but they own their Twitch rights, they own any branding or shirts or anything that they may put out there themselves? Do they own those?
Activision Blizzard owns the intellectual property rights for the teams themselves. So Cloud9, right? They actually own a team, a sub-team that is part of the Overwatch 12. All the proceeds from that Overwatch 12 team go to Activision Blizzard. Cloud9 is still, they existed before the Overwatch League, right? So it gets kind of tricky in terms of here's sort of a subsidiary of a larger company. And I guess at a certain point in time, it would depend on when that contract was negotiated. And I think it'd be on a case-by-case basis, but I think for the most part, that minimum salary that's established is, sort of across the league when you first get in. Does that answer your question?
Well, but could the players still create their own brand, shirts, stuff like that with their name and sell it themselves and own it, or does Activision at this point, would they own it?
I think that would be part of the terms of the contract, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
That's what I'm asking. Standard contract, any idea how they're working or?
It's hard to say standard contract
I
because.
understand that, I'm sorry.
No, I'm glad you're asking these questions because things are, I mean, maybe you guys can answer this better, but I'm going to answer it in one of the slides that I have. Things are changing based on, I wouldn't say outcry necessarily, but based on the popularity of players and people realizing that they are becoming celebrities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just Riot Games, I mean, I can't believe they changed from 2014 to 2016, that's 2 years. They knocked off their non-compete provision. And I want to fact check myself on that, so I'm gonna do more research. But from what I found in my research, basically what they decided was they didn't want to glue a player to a non-compete clause, which means that would restrict a player from joining another team after the contract termination. Because it's, and I'm quoting them, simply unfair and risks the player missing out on key months or even years of their career. So sponsorships and endorsements are of issue, and they vary. It's a case-by-case issue, honestly. And I think that different developers do different things.
Right. And as the sport continues to evolve, I mean, I would imagine that they're looking towards traditional lawyers in a sports setting, right? So if you're a baseball player and you get traded for the team, right, does your endorsement travel with you, right? And I think, I guess the cheapy way to answer your question is if you were to look towards what's going on in traditional major league sports, hockey, baseball, basketball, that type of provision is probably something that, since it hasn't been talked about before, they would look to as a template.
Yeah.
In which case then, all that money would follow the player, because it's the player that is the value to the team. Currently now, it's the other way around until the players, reach the ranks of like a Faker or Siegel or something like that.
Yeah.
But the developers and leagues don't want to try and get this under control now and
Oh, I'm
maybe
sure
all
they
the
do.
investors, give them set ground rules for some of the contracts for the investors to start off with and get rid of some of these problems.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because the LCS rules do, in some capacity, cover some basic terms governing the contracts. It's still, again, esports is still very much something in its infancy. So I expect that we will see greater improvements over time.
And I think that's why we're doing the panel. The questions and concerns you presented is exactly what attracted us towards this issue.
It's even an open field for lawyers. Because
Absolutely.
it really
the Wild West right now.
it is the Wild West. It's like the gold rush.
We're all making it up as we go.
It really is. And I think what Cisco said is correct. Traditional sports law is going to be reflected and will continue to be reflected in esports. Because if esports calls itself a sport and the players are calling themselves an athlete, it's a matter of time that sports law will become, or at least will heavily influence esports as it continues to shape itself.
And not to get too far, but
go
on
ahead.
that point, does the term esports, is it branded? Is it only, can anybody use it?
Well, that's a good question.
There's no trademark on it as far as I know.
Yeah, I don't think it's.
I would imagine it's been out there long enough that if anyone tries to claim it, they're going to have a hard time being able to protect it.
But that means any developer of a game could start calling it esports.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that if it's, right now, the definition is if it's competitive, as long as you're having championships and people are competing and practicing endlessly like an athlete would, it's an esport.
Nobody owns the game of baseball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He created it, but he didn't have a lawyer.
Another thing that I will mention is, and this goes to your question about protections and how do people come up with terms in the contract. I'm going to look to South Korea. Well, two reasons for that. One, South Korea, believe it or not, is arguably the birthplace of esports. They've been in it longer than we have, and they found, I guess, the golden fountain of what we have. So Korea actually does have a government set up association for esports. It's called the Korea Esports Association. I think it's KSPA for short. At least that's the way I say it. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in September 2017, oh good, he has a slide. KSPA made an official announcement that it signed a memorandum of understanding, a contract, with Legacy Pro Law which is a law firm based in Los Angeles to help its players, because it was finding itself in trouble because it couldn't really represent its players. It's not a group of lawyers. It can't do things that a law firm can do for players and investors. So they've partnered with Legacy Pro because, well, one, the language barrier. There were people who could speak Korean and help their players. And the association had done a poll of its players in the association, and the number one thing that they needed help with was contracts. And that shows that players, the number one thing that they need to be aware of is contracts for themselves. They've got to protect themselves. So I just want to point out, if you go to the next slide, yeah, so basically legal advice on visa, tax, contracts. But here's the catch, and this is my opinion. I think that we're still behind, and they're still behind, because this protection and this partnership with the law firm only protects professional players, not amateur players. And the reason why I have a problem with that is because where do pro players come from? Amateur players. How are you going to get to a pro player level? You start out as an amateur. I don't care how great your learning curve is. Everyone starts out somewhere, and that's amateur level. So we still need protections for amateur players, and I think that's where esports is failing us right now. We need to catch up on that. So the next slide, ESPN meets with KSPA. I'm going to try to make this fast since we have a time crunch. The reason why, again, they entered into this contract is because of the protections. It is important to know, you can hit the next slide, to know that an association is not a lawyer. And I know that sounds simple, but a lot of people find themselves in trouble because of this. They find an agent and they think that they can offer them the protections and the representations that a lawyer does, and that is not the case. And again, I know that sounds simple, but go to Twitter, you'll find people complaining all the time and confusing these different entities. So KSPA should not have to fill any role. Oh, go ahead.
Do agents have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients? And if so, are they liable? Should they mislead or guide a player into a bad contract?
No, they should not, and they do have duties. They're just not legal. So, for example, privileges. We're gonna go into. You want to take this, Alex?
I'm not familiar with the agency.
Okay. Agents are not lawyers. They have duties, but not similar duties to lawyers. One duty that's huge and makes you comfortable talking to a lawyer if you murder someone is privilege. That's something that an agent, do not tell your agent that you've done a crime, because they can go and they can tell people. But a lawyer has the duty of confidentiality. So that's something that, a lawyer really just works in your best interest. Whereas an agent, I don't know how it is in esports, but I think it's the same. In entertainment, they take a percentage of what you make. So they do have a financial interest, and lawyers do too, but the difference is agents, they really do kind of right on the back of players, so to speak.
Right, they provide access and relationships, not necessarily protection. Now, they can act in your best interests to do something, but they're not legally bound to do something, right? An agent can get you a bad deal, but unless they're doing something illegal, you can't have any recompense against them.
Exactly. So I'm about wrapped up with that part. I think I kept it pretty simple, and I'm going to leave the rest to Alex Becker just to kind of summarize things, and then I want to get to Gabe's slides.
Okay. Where are we? Keep going? Yeah, that's good. So I think we've organically discussed some of the points that I was going to touch on, which is great because we can just go through those a little more quickly. But my section was essentially about you or a friend is entering into a contract with an esports team tomorrow. What are the things you really need to be looking out for? We've already discussed how the law really isn't cemented in place, so there's really nothing exclusive to esports in the United States. So this means that most of the rights players are going to get are stemming from the contract. Everyone wants to know how much they're getting paid. The typical esports contract comes with base salary, performance-based bonuses, and tournament winnings. If a player is confused on the structure, or they can't estimate kind of what they're going to make at the end of the month, it's time for the player to ask help from the team, or ideally a lawyer if they can afford one. Sorry, the last point in the last slide was having a pay schedule is also very important, because if you have a team that says, oh, we'll get to it next week, we're a little behind on the money right now, that can turn into we've been behind on the money for months and you never end up getting paid, like the case study we looked at. So we discussed a little bit alternative revenue streams for players. Twitch, YouTube, content creation in general has become so lucrative for esport athletes that some of them just quit the competitive scene and turn into content creators. You need to be aware, if you're an existing contract creator, especially if you're an existing one, before you get into the competitive scene, you need to be aware if a team is looking to claim rights to all of that content, or if they're looking for a cut of it. This will show up in esports contracts, and it's something players really need to spot. So what we saw with the player who said he probably made $100 in 4 years, that's likely a case of not being aware of expenses, penalties, or fees. When we talk about penalties, that's things like misbehavior at tournaments. When we're talking about fees, travel is a huge one, right? We have esports tournaments all across the nation, all across the world, all the time. So if your team isn't providing for all of your travel, or a large portion of, you need to reassess how much money you think you're going to be making. This is also a good time to bring up sponsorship guidelines. If you're getting sponsored by Razer and they say, hey, look, when you're on this team, you're sponsored by us, you got your equipment from us, and you cannot be seen on your stream or at a tournament with any other equipment. Are they going to fine you if you show up with Logitech? Something to be conscious of.
This varies from league to league. The equipment that you use as a player is very specific to your preferences and your needs. So I can think of some examples of players having a branded sponsorship with a peripheral or some sort of tech hardware manufacturer, but not necessarily being bound to use their hardware. But again, it all depends on the contract. If the player can show that they have a reason for using the equipment that they do, then they would want to negotiate that at the time of the drafting.
And it's not just abiding by the terms of the contract for your sponsors, but you also want your sponsors to be happy, because they're the ones who are going to fund your later years. So if you have these non-endemic sponsors like Toyota, which was recently signed on, and you have a player who's looking to buy a new car, you're not necessarily forcing them to buy a Toyota, but if you can tell your sponsor, hey, my player is going to buy a new car, can you help them out? They'll give them a discount, so they're seen wherever they are driving a Toyota, right? These are things that are outside of the terms of the contract that you need to think about beforehand, because if you don't have those good relationships, you have to create a cash flow when you are asking for funding, right? And so to your point, you need to know where the next month's paycheck's coming from. And so you have to build out this huge schedule. I mean, it's an esports business, right? And all the business plans, if you're serious about it, need to be laid out on paper. And you have to be able to show, okay, you're gonna run out of money at this point in time, because the sponsor's not just gonna give you a big bag of money and say good luck. They're gonna say, how much do you need in year 1, year 3, year 5, however long you wanna do it. And they're gonna say, oh, I see you have $3 million down for a sponsorship in year 5. Where's that coming from? You have to be prepared to say, well, we're going to extend that contract out. And if your players are having bad behavior, or they are not abiding by the terms of their conduct, or they're seen, driving a competitor's car, your odds of getting a sponsorship are going to be much lower than if you didn't.
Yeah, next slide is fine. So this is kind of general life advice. A lot of people make the mistake of going in overly excited when they start an employment contract or different types of contracts. And a better approach is to be a little more cautious. Think about, okay, what happens if this contract is broken or breached halfway through? What are the ramifications to me, to the employer, if that happens? A big concern that is becoming a higher priority on people's radar are esport injuries, usually hand or wrist things. What happens if A popular esport athlete halfway through a season develops tendinitis or carpal tunnel and cannot play. How does the pay work for him for the rest of the season? And then the next slide is fine. And
I can talk about this one. Okay, so generally, this is a big concern because you take a look at certain people, like Jun, it was Taeyong, started playing StarCraft professionally from as young as 12 or 13. So of course the biggest issue when those people come to the United States is the ability to consent. Now, most professional leagues, well not most, but leagues like Overwatch League and LCS, avoid this issue entirely by requiring the gamers to be 18 and up. However, the tournament with the biggest prize pool, the International, for Dota 2, does not have any such limitations, so those who are under 18 are able to compete. This raises a number of questions like what rights do they have? The biggest one is their ability to consent. Generally, in those situations, they do require a parent's signature. However, any additional protections would be based on the laws of whatever state applies. And generally, you can include that in your contract. You can say the laws of California or Delaware or whatever apply in that contract. So the reason why this is important is that again, it depends what state you're in. If you're using California law, there actually is a law in place protecting the earnings that athletes and actors tend to make. It's called the Coogan Act. When a minor makes money from the work that they do, they get the earnings get put into a trust fund called a Coogan Trust, and they're able to withdraw from that later on.
Once they reach the age of majority.
Once they reach the age of majority, yes. And of course, this only applies if they are being governed by California law. Let's see, there's of course also child labor concerns. Generally under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you generally cannot be under the age of 16. Of course, they do allow an exception for child actors. They make no such provisions for athletes. They do not define sports as work.
Another reason why it would be helpful if we could get a decision on whether esports players are athletes.
Right. Well, I mean, they don't even define what constitutes work. And you also have a maximum of 40 hours a week before you get started, before you have to be paid overtime. Most professional athletes are usually sequestered in the gaming house and play for about 8 hours a day. So if we have 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, let's see, would that clearly goes over 56 hours a week? Yeah, no, I mean, that's that's clear. Are they getting their overtime pay? If it's even work to begin with, not something that's really been answered in court or through legislation, but it's something that we need to look out for. Shall we move on to the next slide?
All right, you guys, I'm going to blaze through this pretty quickly because I want to get to Olympics and things that are fun for everyone. So this actually speaks to Cisco's interest and everyone else who raised their hand that they're interested in investing in esports. So team corporate structure. If that's a term you're going to take away from this panel today, this is the one. Team corporate structure. Just because I think it speaks to every problem that you can see in contracts that people miss. It's very important to understand how esports organizations function. And when I say organizations, I mean the team, the developer, and the player, and the investors. These are all different parties in the esports arena. So investors should care about the type of entity they're investing into. Why? Tax reasons, liability, ownership, the list goes on. Because esports teams can either be a US corporation or a limited liability company, and these all have different legal implications to them. Or it could be an international company, and that also comes with its own complications. Or a group of individuals coming together just to play a game under the same name, and we've seen that. So it's really important to understand what you're getting into as an investor. Yeah, so we can move on to the next slide. Importance of legal entity. Again, the way esports is structured right now is teams within a team. and everyone within that teams within a team has a separate legal entity. So that's why we say get a lawyer. If you really are serious, and we're not saying that because we want money. I mean, we do want money. But don't even come to us. Go to someone. Go to anyone.
You had mentioned, she had mentioned the Wild West, right? Or the Gold Rush.
Gold Rush, yeah.
If you look at history, who made the most money during the Gold Rush? It wasn't the prospectors. It was the people who sold the tools. It was the people who owned the bars. It was the infrastructure that supported the players. They're the ones who were most successful, right? In any new venture, and this is where we are right now. There's a lot of teams out there that they're starting to become very corporate, and they have, business people who are helping them, and they have a social media manager and a marketing person, as well as lawyers, right? We're getting to that state where things are going to get so complicated so fast that you're going to need that, even in terms of the Olympics, right? And so my partner and I were having this debate in terms of what's going to happen. If you look at the Olympics, all these different people involved, right? You have the IOC, you're going to have, and they determine what becomes a sport, right? Like in the 1906 Paris Olympics, rope climbing was a sport. So was pigeon shooting, right? What determines what a sport is not, and that's a debatable thing. But who's going to have the broadcast rights? Is it NBC? Is it ABC? Right? If League of Legends is going to be that sport in the Olympics, and Riot owns the IP that the IOC has to approve, that NBC is going to have the TV but not web rights for, it's going to take so long. I don't know if it'll ever become a sport, right? It's almost like in my later days, working at DC, everyone said, well, why don't you have an Avengers versus a Justice League movie? And I think that would be a great idea, but who's going to direct it? Who's going to distribute it? Who's going to pay for it? It'll get caught up in the courts so long, it'll never get made.
As an IP lawyer, that just sounds like a nightmare.
No, exactly. But if you're looking at the 2020 games or something like that, that's not that far away, right? And which esport, right? Activision Blizzard, they're going to say, well, I think Overwatch should be the sport, right? Riot's going to say, well, I think League should be the sport. They're not going to have more than one, right? Then all of a sudden you have Olympic esports, right?
We can dream.
Yeah, we could.
And that's actually a great
Yeah,
segue because
we don't. Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, so we should talk about the future of esports.
And also, we want to appeal to you guys, and I know there's a call for the talk of Olympics. I
mean, although it's actually interesting, if we talk about the future, yes, I believe for the 2022 Hangzhou Asian Games, second largest Hangzhou, not Hanzhou, second largest Olympic competition next to the second largest sports competition next to the Olympics. They're hosting esports. That's huge. While the law might not necessarily define what constitutes a sport, this could be construed as evidence if we want to see whether current sports law actually applies. In addition to just was it being featured at the Olympics?
There's talk.
There's talk about it.
Last I heard. I'm not up to date on that.
The last Olympics in South Korea, there was an exhibition of StarCraft 2.
It has to be an exhibition sport for 2 cycles before the IOC.
Right. And now, in addition, we do have some additional concerns, not just with that. There's gambling concerns. One of the biggest ones, loot crates. Just last year, Hawaii implemented is in the process of talking about legislation that would prohibit the sale of games with a loot crate feature, not just esports, certain other, even those with a gacha mechanic. So we're talking Fire Emblem Heroes, Grand Blue Fantasy, one of those with that sort of chance of getting something cool like a skin. Yeah, no, there's some regulation that certain countries in Europe, like Belgium, have outlawed it completely. That takes a huge section right out of the market. Now, it's completely understandable too. You don't want minors gambling. In fact, Valve has been sued by this because of the skin gambling issues with CSGO. Just something to look out for in the future, especially since so many young people play esports. And with that, I believe we're out of time. If you have any additional questions or you just want a photo of me, please feel free to come talk to us. We can hang around for a few more minutes.
Actually, I want a photo of you. Do I have permission to take a panel real quick from you guys? Okay.
Anybody in witness protection? No, I run into it before. You would be surprised.
All right. So does that conclude the second group panel?
That does include. Oh, so one thing I would like to mention though is if you can follow us on Facebook, you can find us to say Legalese Podcast. And I say that, well, actually, no, that would be a lie. I say that to get followers, of course. But the second thing is that you can actually, we're going to follow up with you all. And I've kept in my mind like questions that you guys had, lingering questions. And I would like to provide sources and just further details. And we're releasing our second episode on esports, so we get into more details in that second episode. We just recorded this morning, and it's going to get released tomorrow. So just follow us, and we can get. We're going to have a subtopic on our website just dedicated to esports. So, yeah, thanks, you guys.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.